Hello YouTube. Today we're going to create a quick explosion using Explosia FX in the new X-Particles 4. We're going to take the data from that using OpenVDB, import it into Octane, and render out a full explosion animation. And at the end of the video, I'll go ahead and give you some quick pointers for how you can get better results rendering volumetric explosions in Octane Render. Let's get started. Alright, so we've got a brand new scene open in Cinema 4D. Nice and fresh. And the first thing that we're going to need here is an Explosia object. So I'm going to hit Shift-C here and just type it. And I happen to know the size of this. I want it to be on the ground plane, not falling below it. So I'm just going to raise it by 200 centimeters. So now it's level with the ground. And then the other thing is, let's go ahead and create a ground plane real quick, and we'll just scale that up. Nice. That is good. Now the next thing that we're going to need here is an emitter, so I'm going to go ahead and just create some simple geometry here. We'll make it 25 centimeters, and then we'll just raise it up about 5 centimeters off the ground. Great. And this is going to need to actually be an Explosia source, so again, Shift-C, and we will turn it into an Explosia source. And then I like to take, I've gotten a lot of questions on Instagram about how I have smoke that looks so detailed, and one of the ways I do that is I grab this curl slider and I bring it up to somewhere close to 50%. So with that, we'll just hit play, and as you can see, we are getting some smoke. But it's not quite as detailed as we want it to be, so we're going to go over to our Explosia settings, and we're going to change some things in here. One of those things is the voricity. If we crank that all the way up, you can see it gets pretty gnarly. We're not looking for that, but I do want to bring this up to about 30%, and then I'm going to bring the radius down to like 3. And now if we hit play, you can see there's just a little bit more detail in this. I'm actually going to turn it down just a little bit more, maybe more like 25%. All right. And then the next thing that we want is to bring in some turbulence here. Now, add mode is the default, and that's pretty crazy. It's going to add 10 centimeters of strength to the turbulence every frame. That's not what we really want here. So I'm going to set this up as the max. And then we're going to set the strength to like 4. And we'll hit play just to see what that looks like. And that is looking like some pretty detailed but also irregular smoke, but it has enough voricity. It's sticking together enough to where it looks reasonably realistic. So I'm liking the way that that looks. The next thing I'm going to do is just come over here to the voxel size and set that to 1.5. And you saw that this grid in the background changed. This grid has a bunch of boxes or squares that represent the voxel size. Kind of looks like maybe one of your dad's old shirts. So essentially these things are rendered in 3D pixels of volume data called voxels, and I'm lowering the size so that we can get more detail, just like you would have more detail if you had more pixels or smaller pixel size. So anyway, set that to 1.5. That's going to be good for our purposes, and it's still going to render out or simulate pretty quickly. The next thing I'm going to do is create a cache object. And the most important thing that we can change here is to change this to OpenVDB, because that is the file format that Octane Render is going to be expecting. And then the other thing I recommend is that you do change this folder so that you're not just dumping folders full of volume data in your home documents directory. So I'll go ahead and change that now. And there we go. We are all ready to build our cache. And this really isn't going to take very long, but I am going to go ahead and fast forward here so that you don't have to wait the minute or so that this is going to take. Awesome. Looks like the cache is ready, and so is the cache. So let's go to the Octane viewport and see nothing, because the data still hasn't been imported to Octane. But what we are going to do is we're going to come over here to Objects, and we're going to select Octane VDB Volume. I'm just going to scale this down. Doesn't need to be too big. Don't want it in our way here. And what we're going to need to do is bring in the VDB files that XParticles just created. But before we do that, I could just put one file in here and it would read that file and it would be fine. But we wanted to do an animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure these options first, because there are a lot of glitches around. For example, if you set your start value by accident higher than your end value just because you're setting them in the order that they're presented, Octane will completely crash and Cinema 4D will also crash, and you'll be swearing at yourself for not having saved more recently. So let's go ahead and set these up. I know off the top of my head that it's a 90 frame simulation. So we'll set that there, and then we will go ahead, and we know that the XParticles outputs a 6-digit frame number, so we'll set that to 6, and then it starts on frame 1, so we'll set that to 1. And now we can open our cache files and open our explosion. And if it worked right, you should see data here and not some error message. And now if we push through our timeline, we can see the smoke. This is great. Awesome. So the next thing that we want to do here is go ahead and set the emission mapping to heat. And that's just going to help us later when we try to make this look like an explosion. It's going to make it easier to separate our smoke from our fire. So if you just came here to learn how to bring this data into Octane and you already know how to set up the materials, then you can probably stop watching at this point. You probably have everything that you need. But if you're looking to pick up some quick tips on how to make this smoke look really cool, get kind of an explosion, like a photorealistic explosion look out of it, then you may want to continue to watch, because that's what we're going to get into. And the first thing that we're going to do in order to do that is open up Octane Settings and bring it over here. And I'm going to set this to path tracing. You need to be using either path tracing or PMC, and nobody really uses PMC, so we're going to use path tracing here. I'm just going to set this to a sane number like 768. I'm going to set our diffuse and specular depth to something low, because we have a pretty simple scene and I just want to make sure nothing goes crazy and makes our renders take a really long time. GI clamp is going to be really important for when you have bright light sources or when you're working with volumes. I like to set that to 1. Sometimes it needs to be higher than 1, but in most cases 1 is low enough, and it helps get rid of fireflies. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and turn on adaptive sampling. That should speed things up. We'll leave these settings at the default though. And then we're going to come over to our camera imager. Normally I would set this to gamma 2.2 and linear for like a production environment, but I'm just going to go ahead and set this to portrait here, because it gives us a nice look, and the filmic feel is going to be nice for this particular explosion. And then I'll go ahead and just bring our hot pixel down just to make sure we don't get any hot pixels. The only other setting that we're going to be addressing in the camera imager is saturate to white, but we're going to adjust that to taste later on. The next thing that we're going to do here is start to work with our medium. So if I come in here, to get this smoke looking nice and thick, well, first let's go ahead and just turn off our emitter so we can't see it anymore. So now it's just kind of emitting from nothing. To make this look a lot thicker, I'm going to bring this down the volume step length to 1. And pretty instantaneously here, you can see that this smoke now has a lot more thickness, a lot more volume to it. But it doesn't need to be quite that thick. We'll go ahead and set this to 60. And then the other thing that we're going to do is click on this fire preset here. Oh, and that just changed some of my settings. I'll set those back 0.1 and 60. Now, if you look at our fire, it's pretty much mostly red. And that's not what we want, and that's going to be a function of this emission ramp here. But before we go any further, I want to tweak our lighting setup just so that we can really see what we're working with here. So to do that, I'm going to, first of all, turn off this ridiculous black background by creating an Octane Sky, a HDRI emitter, and setting the power all the way down. So now the only light source in our scene is the fire itself, but that's also not what we want. I'm going to create a null and just bring it up to maybe 100 centimeters here to function as our target, and then I'm going to create an Octane targeted light. Now, you'll get more detail, or the appearance of more detail anyway, out of smaller lights because they cast harsher shadows, and those shadows bring out the detail. So I'm going to make this something like a foot in diameter, so we'll punch in 6 inches here. And that's going to give us a much more detailed look. We'll come into our options. We might want this to be a little bit brighter. Set this to 100. We'll set our temperature to something nice and cool. And you know what? Let's go ahead and create a camera so that we can just see what we're doing. We'll bring this over here, something like that. And we're going to give it, again, a nice cool color. We're going to duplicate it, Command C, Command V. We're going to bring this one over here. Whoops. Going to bring this one over here to be more of a side light. You're not quite that far over. And we're going to bring it down in terms of temperature. Bring it in a little closer. All right, that's fine. That'll do for now. So now we've got some light in here that's just going to help balance things out. And you're seeing a little bit of fireflies here. Another thing that we need to do is come into our VDB volume and set the emission sampling rate. And for explosions, it's really good to just have this be a pretty high number, and that'll clean up a little bit faster. Okay, so how do we get this to stop looking like a big red cloud? Unless that's what you're going for, then more power to you. But we're looking to create a photorealistic explosion. We're going to come to the volume gradient. You see we've got a bunch of different options here: absorption, scattering, and emission. We're going to come to the emission ramp under emission. And this max value, you see it's supposed to be going from yellow to red, but it's basically just red. You got a little bit of yellow down in here, and that has to do with this max value. I'm going to set this to 0.5. Because that's the way that I like to work with the emission, because I actually don't want it to really be nearly as fiery up at the top as it is at the bottom. And again, all of this is based off of the temperature channel, which was determined by our explosion data that we created in Explosia FX. And if we needed to, we could resimulate that or change that, but we don't need to do that. We could set this to 1, and you would get kind of more of a yellow to red. Maybe set it to 2. Yeah, kind of get more of a yellow to red look, but that's also not what we're going for. So I'm going to set this back to 0.5, and then I like this, if I click on the, spin this down and then go to load preset, I like this flame preset. It gets pretty close to photorealistic results right off the bat, but we are going to tweak it a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and bring this yellow down a little bit further, bring this orange down, bring this red down, and then, you know what, I think we could actually go to like 0.8 here. Yeah, that's more like it. And then I'm going to bring this black in, because I don't actually want the top of the cloud to have any emission. So we're just going to keep bringing things down here. Maybe we could set this to 1. I know you were probably sitting at home thinking you should set that to 1. 1 just makes sense as a value, and now you're vindicated. But I've done this a lot of times, and this is the first time I've actually used 1. 1 is just kind of what's working here in this particular instance, and I've had different settings and all of that. Anyway, you're probably going to be playing around with adjusting both of these. quite a bit, but I'm liking the way that this looks. Now I kind of want to refine the stuff that's just smoke. So I'm going to go ahead and come to the absorption and scattering and bring those down so that I can work with them. And we're going to set these to float values just because it's going to make it a little bit easier to work with. I'm not going to have to be setting RGB sliders every time. So now we can spin these down and we've got our float. Now, absorption has to do with how much light is actually blocked by the smoke. So the higher, well, this is actually inverted. So the lower that it is, the more light your smoke is going to be blocking, and that's going to cast things like shadows, which are going to bring out some of the details in your smoke. Scattering has to do with how much light is just scattered, obviously, by your smoke, and it's actually, the higher this is, the lighter your smoke is going to be. But it's not quite a one-to-one thing. It's not like these are adjusting the same thing. The absorption is going to get you more shadows, and scattering is going to get you more light kind of passing through and being emitted. So I'm mostly liking the way this looks. Maybe we could bring this up a little bit. See, if I were to set this all the way up, now we get this. You can see that it's just, the fire is just emitting straight through, but that's not the look that we're going for here. We could set this to maybe, yeah, right around 0.4, bring this down a little bit. And that is looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to come over here and just, I may not even need to do this, but I'm going to bring in saturate to white. And what this does is it takes your, the things that are emitting and it saturates them to white. And the lower that this is, the brighter something has to be saturated to white. And I do usually like to turn this on. It also affects the bloom and glare, which we're going to go ahead and turn on, because what's an explosion without some bloom and glare? And my preferred way to work with these is to crank them up and then bring them back down to something that I feel like is reasonable. It kind of gives me a feel for what exactly is blowing out at first, so that I can then know what I'm looking at, basically. And then for glare, I like to set up kind of an anamorphic style flaring. I don't think it's really built with this in mind, but it's a trick that I discovered a while back. If you set the ray amount to 1 and you set the glare angle to 90, we start to get this kind of anamorphic flaring. And man, if we were J.J. Abrams, we would be done. I mean, this is gold right here. I may even submit this to him for like as a job application. But no, we're going to go ahead and bring it down to, say, 19. And then the other thing that you can do, even when this is up, is just start to blur it so it's not quite as extreme and recognizable. So we'll set this at, like, I don't know, 18.375012. That's looking pretty good to me. All right, so now let's go ahead and create a camera. And we're going to make the camera... Oh, we already have a camera, so we'll delete that camera. Because this original camera is way better. When I'm working with explosions, I like to use a telephoto lens. Because if I were working with explosions in real life, I would want to use a telephoto lens. Because I value my eyebrows and, you know, the flesh on my face. So we're going to... Let's switch to this camera. And whoa, we're really zoomed in. I'm going to zero out some of these coordinate settings... 0, 0. Actually, I'm going to zero them all out. And then we'll just zoom out. And now we can raise the camera. Whoops. Raise the camera up. I know how to use Cinema 4D, guys. Don't worry. Awesome. This is starting to look pretty good. Pretty good. Not going to win any awards, but, you know, it's decent for a tutorial. All right. And that'll just about do it. Let's go ahead and... I actually don't want it to be quite this telephoto. We'll go to 85. I know that's technically not telephoto, right? You guys who are photographers are probably at home going, that 85 is technically not telephoto, David. Chill out, buddy. Chill out. All right, and then I'm going to bring this light. This will be the first light, and we'll just push that out of the way so we can't see it anymore. And that is your explosion. Now, if it's looking a little bit too bright, which, you know, maybe it is, we can also adjust this here. So we've got the power slider here, just like with any emitter. So we could bring this down maybe to something like that. And then, maybe to something like, let's go with 0.333. Yeah. And then play with saturate to white again. I'm pretty happy with that. That's pretty good. All right, so the other thing that I'm going to go ahead and do here is I am going to upload this Cinema 4D file to the internet. If you look in the description below, you will find this Cinema 4D file. It's not going to include the VDB files. You'll have to come into the cache object and build the cache yourself, and probably change this unless your home directory is the same name as mine and you actually happen to have these folders. But yeah, you'll be able to just build the cache yourself, and then should be able to just load it into Octane again by going over to here. And I'm giving you this. You can use it in whatever you want, but I'm thinking you'll just be able to use it as a playground so that you can get started learning these things. Tweaking settings, maybe redo, add some more voricity or less voricity, or you know, whatever you want to do. So go ahead and grab that, and that's it. Well, thank you for watching. If you liked this video, do me a favor and hit the like button. I mean, that's the least you can do, right? You liked it, you could like it. That'll help more people find it. And then the other thing you could do if you enjoy this kind of content is hit subscribe. This is actually my first tutorial, so you can go ahead and hit the subscribe button and see when I make more, if I make more, which I'm planning to. Totally.